You pick up the phone. It is heavy in your hand, heavier than anything you carry today. You press it to your ear and you hear a click, and then a voice. Not a recording, not a menu. A real human voice, calm and clear, saying two words. Number, please? You tell her what you need, and within seconds, she is already connecting you. You do not dial, you do not press anything. You just talk, and she does the rest. That was the telephone operator, and for a long time, she was the invisible center of American communication. She is gone now, of course, has been for decades. Direct dialing, automation, and eventually digital networks made her position disappear so quietly that most people never really marked the moment it happened. But she was there for a long time, longer than most people remember, and the world she worked in is worth looking back at. To understand the operator, you have to understand what telephones actually were in the early and middle part of the 20th century. They were not personal devices. They were not tools of individual freedom. They were shared infrastructure, more like a utility than a gadget. In many homes, especially rural ones, multiple households shared a single line. In cities, the phone was often in the hallway or the kitchen, and every call you made passed through a central office where real people sat at long wooden switchboards, managing the flow of voices across wires. The switchboard operator was almost always a woman. That was no accident. In the early years of telephone service, boys had been hired to work the boards. They came from the culture of telegraph offices, but they were impatient. They argued with callers. They played pranks on the lines. By the 1880s, telephone companies had largely replaced them with women, who were considered better suited to the patient, courteous, and precise work of connecting calls. What began as a practical decision became a defining feature of American telephone culture for the better part of a century. By the 1940s and 1950s, the operator was woven into the texture of daily life in ways that are hard to fully describe today. If you needed a number and did not have it, you called the operator. If there was an emergency and you couldn't think straight, you called the operator. If you were traveling and needed to place a long-distance call from your hotel room, the operator handled the routing. She was the one who woke you up when you asked for a wake-up call. She was the one who helped you track down a relative in another state. In small towns especially, the local operator often knew half the town by voice. She knew who was sick, who was traveling, who needed the doctor. She was trusted with a kind of quiet knowledge that no one quite asked for, but everyone quietly relied on. The work itself was demanding in a specific and unique way. Operators sat for hours at massive switchboards covered with cords and jacks and small lights. When a call came in, a light would flash. She would plug in a cord, say, "Number, please," take down the request, and physically connect the caller by inserting a second jack into the correct jack. For local calls, this might take seconds. For long-distance calls, it could take longer, requiring coordination with operators in other cities, routed through multiple exchanges. The pace during peak hours was relentless. The standard of courtesy was enforced strictly. Many telephone companies trained their operators to maintain a specific tone and speaking speed. Friendliness was expected, but efficiency was demanded. The first sign that this world was going to change came in 1919 when a Kansas City undertaker named Almon Stroger invented the rotary dial system. His motivation, according to the story, was personal. He believed the local telephone operator was routing his business calls to a competitor who happened to be her husband. Whether or not that's entirely true, his invention was real. The automatic exchange allowed callers to dial numbers directly without going through a human being. The technology existed for decades before it became widespread. But by the post-war years, telephone companies were investing heavily in automation. Direct dialing was faster, cheaper to scale, and it removed the human variable from the equation entirely. The rollout was gradual. In large cities, direct local dialing became standard through the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Long-distance dialing took longer to automate. As late as the early 1960s, many Americans still needed an operator to place calls across state lines. But by the mid-1960s, direct distance dialing was expanding rapidly, and the operator's role was narrowing. She became a specialist for problems rather than a first point of contact. Assistance calls, collect calls, calls to places the system couldn't quite reach on its own. The telephone companies were open about what they were doing. Automation meant lower labor costs. A human operator could handle a certain number of calls per hour. An automated system could handle thousands simultaneously, around the clock, without breaks, without illness, without a salary. The economics were not complicated. The transition displaced an enormous number of workers. At its peak in the 1940s, AT&T alone employed hundreds of thousands of operators. By the 1980s, that number had fallen dramatically. The women who had defined the sound of American communication were quietly let go, retired, or moved into the small number of remaining specialized roles. What replaced her was, at first, just silence. The soft click of a connection made without any human acknowledgement. Then, eventually, recordings. Then automated voice systems that ask you to say or press what you needed. And somewhere in that progression, something small but real disappeared from the experience of using a telephone. The sense that the system was staffed by someone, that there was a person on the other side who was paying attention and who would help you if you got lost. That kind of help is harder to find now. The systems we use today are more powerful than anything she could have imagined. But they are also, in a quiet way, more indifferent. They route us and sort us and connect us, and they do it faster than she ever could have. But they don't say your name. They don't recognize your voice from last week. They don't notice if you sound frightened. If you remember the telephone operator, even faintly, I'd be glad to hear about it in the comments. What you called for, what she sounded like, whether there was a particular one in your town that everyone seemed to know. And if you're new to this channel, welcome. We spend time here looking back at the small things, the ones that quietly disappeared from American life without much ceremony. If that sounds like something you would like to stay for, the subscribe button is right there. We'll be here.